Tonight, I am going to be talking about the book How to Do Life by Tralik Rinpoche and covering chapter 18 of the book, which is titled Varying Approaches to Meditation. And what he is talking about here are meditations that are used to overcome our negative states of mind and our negative emotions. So the first point that he brings up is, well, why should we be motivated to overcome these negative emotions and states of mind? And he comes from a different direction than is usually used. And it is because these negative states of mind cause us suffering and cause other people suffering, as opposed to, well, you're breaking one of the 10 virtuous actions, you're engaging in non-virtue. He feels that stressing this is more important because if we are really, like all sentient beings, wanting to be happy and free of suffering, that this will be the most persuasive motivation for us. Plus, this will automatically lead us to engage in virtuous behavior and to avoid non-virtue. So he feels that avoiding shoulds or shouldn'ts, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, or because it's a sin and you'll be punished or you'll accumulate bad karma, this is not necessarily the most important. On the other hand, the more we indulge in these kinds of actions, the greater the tendency for these mental states of mind to develop into character traits and habits and condition our mind in a negative way. He says we can end up in our own, quote, head, very Western, overthinking the problem, mulling over it obsessively, and on and on and on. So he feels that these negative states of mind can really affect us very strongly as we get into these patterns more and more, mull over it, think about it, and on and on and on. They can affect our body, our speech, and our mind in negative ways. Emotions have a tendency, he had mentioned in a previous chapter, to become strategic, to become very complicated, even convoluted. We use them to accomplish certain goals, certain outcomes, and they get to be a downward spiral, can lead to depression, despondency, despair. My own opinion is that probably all of you know people like this that are burnt out, unhappy, miserable, and their negative emotions, you might say, have completely gotten the best of them. So working with our negative states of mind and emotions is a matter of our fundamental and overall sense of spiritual well-being and also our psychological well-being. The two are not separate, but he mentions them both. If we have altruistic and caring motives, a sense of well-being or a sense of wisdom will follow us automatically. Then he goes into different definitions of wisdom. Technically, we have Sherab or Prajna, and we have Yeshe or Jnana, Jnana. So to explain these, Sherab is transcendental wisdom. It is understanding the logic behind the world of appearances, understanding how things work and why they work this way, understanding karma, and so forth. That leads to primordial wisdom, or yeshe, or jnana. This is something that has been ever present in our minds, but just not realized. But the more we understand from a relative standpoint how things work, then it automatically, you might say, transforms into this primordial wisdom. The primordial wisdom is, in his words, the coming together of this transcendental wisdom and goodness, and also this understanding of emptiness. Maybe a better word is the experience of emptiness. All of this leads to attaining lasting happiness and also, of course, Buddhahood. He then mentions that we're also happier when we have people that we love, that we can care about, having friends, when we have nurturing relations with others, and that satisfying our sensual pleasures doesn't usually lead to a happiness that lasts. Traditionally, they use the example in Tibetan Buddhism of it's like drinking salt water. It just leaves you thirstier, doesn't leave you satisfied. So he says that wisdom allows us, this transcendental wisdom or Shera, leads us to be able to distinguish between needs and wants. This could be called discriminating wisdom. So here's a quote from the book, quote, "To truly be happy, we must have good relationships with others based on an affectionate and loving relationship." So these relationships are really quite important. So we can train our minds so that we can be closer and more affectionate to others and having relationships that are not, I believe he used the word corrupted by excessive attachment and obsession. Now, the following meditation techniques that he talks about in this book remedies to the various negative states of mind and emotions that we confused ordinary human beings have. These techniques help us work with our emotions in a skillful way and purify our emotions. It's important to note that others, especially difficult people, can be our best teachers. And also, he stresses this point in a number of places in this chapter, and that is that our thoughts and our emotions are closely connected to each other, and they're interrelated, and they're difficult to separate. So he does not really spend a lot of time on trying to separate negative states of mind and negative emotions. Now, going into the different approaches that he talks about in this book. To begin with, the reason why we want to work with these emotions, these negative emotions and states of mind, is to bring more happiness into our lives and our experience. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are many remedies for these negative emotions. There is a logic to them and an order in which you would use them. One size does not fit all. It really depends a lot on the context and where you are on the path and your own abilities to deal with these destructive negative states of mind. He stresses that if you use these out of context or are used improperly, that problems can arise, and instead of being a remedy, it could cause more negative states of mind. So there's a developmental process and a maturing that is involved as we travel the path. He doesn't use the word self-secret, but as you travel the path, you start opening up to your own wisdom, and you start seeing things in a way that you were incapable of seeing even a year earlier, maybe even 6 months or even a day earlier. And so we need to realize where we are on the path and use a method that's most appropriate for where we are on the path. It's important also to talk to your lama or your guru about where you are on the path and what remedies are the best for you to use. The first remedy that he talks about is very simple. It's noticing destructive mental states. Very simply, it's training our mind to notice what's going on in our mind, to see what's entering our mind before a negative state manifests. First, we tame our mind and then we train it. So, taming the mind means developing our concentration so that there is less distraction. If we can train our mind to the point where if we place it on an object, it doesn't immediately jump in a different direction on another object. This is necessary if we're going to start noticing how we react to external situations and even thoughts and emotions that arise. The more aware we are of how our mind is influenced by these things, how it happens, this is very important. This is really the beginning. It's the beginning of getting to know ourselves, of getting to know how these negative states and emotions are generated. The power of observation is really very, very important. We can't observe things clearly, then we really can't see much. We can't be aware of much. So, step by step, we try being more aware of what's entering our mind and how this progresses. The second is noticing what attracts and repels us and what we are indifferent to. So these are the three negative states of mind: being attached to what we find pleasant, wanting to get away from what we find unpleasant, and then finally, what things we find are really not interesting at all, and we can just as soon ignore them or pretend that they aren't there. Now, this is not getting into deep analysis or looking at subtleties. It's just how am I reacting to whatever it is that I'm experiencing, and being able to say, well, I'm attracted, I have aversion, or I am indifferent to this. So, first we have the awareness, and then the awareness of what our reaction is. And then finally is revealing fixation. So, once we have noticed and become aware of these three main emotions, we learn how to deal with our different states of mind, different emotions for better outcomes. And we can begin this process through, first of all, meditation, sitting meditation. And then we'll follow different ways of working with this, different techniques that he talks about. And we also can make changes in our life, our circumstances that we have control over. You can, for instance, if you have excessive attachment and desire, stay out of places that bring that up. Or you can reduce what you're putting into your mind that arouse desire. It might be, this is just an example, and I'm not saying any of you are doing this, but if you like to chat anonymously on these chat sites with a woman, maybe just quit doing that. I go on Facebook, there are all these ads for single older women that are looking for a man. You know, stay off of those places. Do a diet of what you're putting into your mind. So it can be as simple as staying away from the mall, staying away from bars, staying out of situations that cause anger or desire or indifference to arise. Finally, he says to keep in mind how important context is with these different techniques here. So the first one is called replacing the object of desire with an object that is opposite. You figure out what the klesha is that is strong that you want to counteract. And he uses the example of meditation on the repulsiveness of the body. When you have excessive desire for another person because of their body. By doing this little by little, we are disrupting the minds. I use the term ruts. We get stuck in going a certain way. Something happens, this desire arises, and we just go right for it, so to speak, because of having such a strong habit. So the idea here is to imagine that the object of desire, if it's a person, underneath all that skin is just blood, pus, raw meat, urine, and all kinds of disgusting things, even to the point of visualizing a person with all the skin missing. You're not so much attracted to them. It isn't to think of the body as being repulsive per se, but it is to get our mind thinking in a totally different way. It's like doing something different, and this upsets the pattern that we usually follow if it is attachment to beauty and so forth. And this gradually weakens the pattern. I think a good analogy is putting sand in the engine or the mechanism, and little by little, the sand in the mechanism wears out the mechanism and it no longer works. If you don't believe me, put it in your car crankcase and see what happens to your engine. So we weaken it, and it gradually loses its power. This can be done with anything. He talks about a car. Think about a car that you might desire after a hurricane goes through and it's flooded and underwater and so forth. So we can use this to help weaken, counteract, and eventually overcome whatever habitual pattern we have. We have a distorted image in our mind of this object of attachment or object of aversion, and we carry it around. It becomes deeply rooted and may seem impossible to not go that same direction day after day, day after day. But by doing this and doing it with a visualization is important. This helps at least put us off, give us, you might say, a pause, a time to see things a little differently, and so forth. Here is a quote at the end of this section. Another technique that is discussed is that instead of thinking of the car, holiday, etc., as a whole piece, we can dissect it. Often we subsequently do not find its constituent parts so attractive. Let's talk about a vacation. It's north up here, winter up here, maybe a vacation in Florida. Well, think of being in an airport and you've booked on Southwest Airlines. Yeah, maybe that part isn't so pleasant after all. It's amazing how smoothly our plans can look and how poorly they actually go when we are following the plan. The next is removing oneself from the situation for a short time. So this means interrupting this negative or disturbed mind for what he calls a short period. And he's talking about a weekend or even a whole week. This might be one of the reasons why we do weekend programs here, that it kind of disrupts this pattern, that it gets you out of the rut that you are in. And it focuses your mind on virtuous behavior if you're doing a retreat of some kind or another. So, this is again another step in this direction of staying away from things that cause desire to arise, that cause anger to arise, and so forth. And this being alone gives us time to work on ourselves, work with ourselves without the usual distractions. Quote, this can provide a new perspective and give space or pause between oneself and the triggers. Such distance can give us the opportunity to feel and respond differently. Again, a word that jumps out at me is respond. That says two words, differently, instead of the same old, same old. When we are in a situation and respond quickly, almost always it is a result of a habitual pattern, a gut reaction, and so forth. And there's not a whole lot of discernment that is involved. Again, this is a sales technique too, when they say, This sale ends at midnight, or this sale ends tomorrow, or these prices are good until supply runs out, and on and on and on, all intending to make you make a quick decision without thinking about it. So the third technique is titled Analyzing the Effect of Negative Mental States. So after doing the preceding practices, we do what's called analytical meditation. Vipassana is the Sanskrit name for this. And so the meditator takes a little bit of quiet time and they start asking questions about negative states of mind and emotions. Quote, for example, is my anger serving any purpose? What effect does anger have? Even though anger is said to not be a good thing, is it really bad or is it just said to be bad? What are the consequences of my anger? What impact does my anger have on others? These sorts of things. Question, question, chew on it, come up with an answer, see if it makes sense. So we've all received teachings, and now we have a chance to see if they are true and if they make sense. This is not just accepting the teaching at face value and saying that, well, this is in the book, therefore it must be true, or this is what Lama Yeshe said, so it must be true. It's taking it into your own experience. Basically, we have to convince ourselves that these poisons are a problem, that they cause us suffering and they cause suffering to other people. If we don't convince ourselves, then it's not going to have that significant a meaning. It's just, well, we're doing this because we're supposed to be doing this. This type of reasoning is extremely helpful to bring these teachings into our hearts and our minds and to really see the truth that is embodied by these teachings. The next is analysis in terms of impermanence. This is a second type of analytical meditation or vipassana. So here in our meditation, we analyze the idea of everything being impermanent, including our negative states of mind, our opinions, our memories, all of this. They're actually fixed and unchanging in our mind while the world and everything else continues to change. So if we can see these things as being fixed and unchanging, this encourages us to change and see our emotions differently. It's interesting now, for Christmas, I have visited some friends, and of course, many of these people, I haven't seen them for a year or more, and by gosh, they look different than the last time I saw them. They're older, but the picture I have in my mind was of them a year or two earlier. And realizing this, and the same thing for our emotions and how we respond to the world, that it's all changing. It's not fixed, even though our mind fixates on it as thinking that it is always the same. So, with this understanding of impermanence, we can loosen up our grasping to things being solid, unchanging. This is tremendously beneficial. Now, all these practices need to be combined with shamatha meditation. That's a very important point, that if our mind isn't calm and a little clearer, the rest of these things will have little benefit. So we do shamatha meditation before we do analytical meditation. The next is inducing positive states of mind. Here, instead of coming up with an antidote to the negative states of mind, we actually cultivate positive mental states. And the most common ones are the four immeasurables, which are meditations on love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Just being aware of these four. And if you are having an angry thought, replacing it with wanting all beings to be happy. If you have that wish, there won't be room in your mind for anger, and the anger will diminish and the habit will become weakened. The habit of getting angry. So instead of wanting to overcome excessive desire, we meditate on compassion. If we have empathy and sympathy for others, which flows from genuine compassion, we won't be excessively attached. We want them to be happy rather than wanting to control them or be jealous of them. We will be more kind hearted. There's just not room for this extreme attachment. Jealousy, we meditate on joy. With that, it's difficult for jealousy to arise. We meditate on wanting others to be happy and having a good and fulfilling life instead of wanting to compete with them and outdo them. So there are lots of different things that can be done to have positive thoughts and emotions in our mind. Next is a subtler level of analysis. That's the title of this section. And this is to focus on the relative reality of our experience, that destructive states of mind have causes and conditions, and as a result, they do not have any self nature, that they are interdependent and related to many factors. Quote, this is seen as an extremely liberating insight to gain. If we realize that these things are interdependent, that they are not independent, free of causes and conditions, that things seem less solid and easier to work with. Whatever it is that we get attached to or have an aversion for or want to ignore, that it depends on causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions depend on other causes and conditions. And if you do a deep analysis, you will find that destructive states of mind cannot be clearly defined. In fact, you can't even find them if you look deeply enough. So it's really good to look at these destructive emotions and break them down into parts and smaller parts and see that it's all causes and conditions and parts, and there's nothing really solid and fixed there. It's just experience. And so these mental states, these negative mental states are due to causes and conditions, don't have any fixed nature. Quote, if they are insubstantial, subsequently, everything that is going on in our mind is movement and transformable. So everything is open to change. Then he comes to the section called Transforming Negativity. And this is transforming the kleshas into the five wisdoms. This is basically done through Vajrayana practice, deity practice. And Chenrezig, for example, is, you might say, the embodiment of compassion of all the Buddhas of the three times. And he transforms suffering into happiness. He transforms pain into happiness. There are different deities that you practice in Vajrayana. That is the way Vajrayana works. He doesn't talk too much more about it at this time, and I'm going to leave it there. The next is called Bare Awareness of Our Innate Wisdom. And this is Mahamudra meditation. And again, he doesn't talk too much about it, but he distinguishes between our gross mental processes, our subtle mental processes, and our very subtle mental processes. Simply put, the gross mental processes are when we are totally caught up with our kleshas, our disturbing emotions, and negative mental states. This is a state of being intensely overcome with negative emotions. Subtle is, in his words, the normal functioning of our consciousness, that we're still confused, but it is not as intense as gross thoughts and gross emotions. And then very subtle means this actual very basic and untainted bare awareness. Here's a quote about that. By recognizing this bare awareness, we come to have a realization of our own innate wisdom. Wisdom is not something that we have to acquire, but to realize. End quote. I'm not going to go into Mahamudra too much more here, and he doesn't either. The way it works in simple language is that we maintain our awareness and that these negative states of mind naturally subside, that we're not even trying to be aware, we just are aware. Now comes the conclusion of this chapter, and there's a lot in here, by the way. So it's important to use the context to decide which remedy to apply. We have to know where we are on the path in order to apply the remedy properly. Again, it's important to consult with the Lama when deciding which is most important and best for me to be using. And also, it's important to realize that transformation is possible if we use the remedy that we need to use to transform. There's a richness to these remedies, they all work. We can experience tremendous progress, happiness, richness by using the proper remedy at the proper time. And all of this leads to growth, and as a result, better relations with ourselves, better relations with other people, with the world, and so forth. And I have a final quote here. One uncovers wisdom in order to help oneself, and the goodness is developed in order to help others. The compassion flows from there. So the question is, explain a little bit more about the five kleshas being the five wisdoms. And very simply, there is wisdom in each of these kleshas. They are associated with a particular Buddha family. There are five Buddha families, and each one has a specific wisdom and a specific klesha. And when the klesha is purified, it becomes a wisdom. I will say that, again, this is Vajrayana, and this is different from the Mahamudra approach. But the idea is that the wisdom that is associated with excessive desire is discriminating wisdom, that you can discriminate all these different aspects of an object, see all the little details, but instead of becoming attached to them, you just are very aware of them. So, for instance, you might see the person that you're sitting next to as being someone you are attached to, or you might just see all the different, what would I say, wonderful things about him, and you can let it go. These Vajrayana visualizations are all made out of light. They're not fixed, they're not substance. And so it introduces this idea of change, impermanence, not being solid, not being made out of substance. And gradually, over the years of practice, we start seeing things more with more a sense of space and openness, and realizing that we can see all these little differences, visualize all these different aspects, but let go. Yeah, the question is about visualizing a person that you are attached to as being just made out of blood and bone and muscle and other disgusting things. And that seems contrary to the idea of compassion and wanting the person to be happy, free of suffering, and so forth. And this is one reason why Tralek Rinpoche mentioned this technique but didn't go into it in great detail because it's so easy to misunderstand it. As he said, it has to be in context. It isn't blank, just across the board. But if you find that you are obsessing about a person, wanting to, shall we say, possess them or whatever, and you're obsessing, then this might be a good remedy. But realize that you also want that person to be happy and free of suffering. It's not that you just look at them as a pile of bones and pus and blood and other revolting things, but this is a remedy for your own projections. It has nothing to do with the other person. It's your own projections that you are working with. Just came to my mind, and I don't know if it was in a horror movie or what, or a fairy tale, but the object of your desire suddenly turns into a vampire, and suddenly you're not attached to the vampire. But this is the idea. It is to cut that fixation on that other person's body or whatever. The question is that when we want a relationship to develop, there's going to be an element of attachment. And Tralik Rinpoche uses the word excessive in front of attachment usually, which is a little bit unusual, but I like that, the way he uses it. And so it's to put limits on the attachment. You want to have a healthy relationship, but you don't want to possess the person.